Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the last video tutorial, we implemented the required views to display the user's profile details, to help them change their password, and also to display the user activity related to the admin user. In this particular video tutorial, we will be focusing on creating our API endpoints and implement API versioning in our application. Before we do that, there is one piece of code that we would need to add in the index.cshtml file of the profile view, which is the range validator for our checkbox. Now, if we go back to the finish project and look at the form that we have over here, when we try to submit this form, we are validating if the terms have been accepted. And only if the terms have been accepted, then the user can submit the form. This particular logic is implemented using the range attribute, which is set on the isTermAccepted property on the addUserModel class. So in case if you want any other property that needs to be set with a default value of true, you would use this range attribute. So whenever the form is submitted and the values from the form are tried to be mapped over to the model class, the attribute here will be used to check if the value that we have set here matches the value that we have received from the form that is submitted. So in the index.cshtml file, we are returning if the element is of element type checkbox, then we are returning it as element.check, or else we are just returning the default validation. So that was it for the index.cshtml file that was missing, so I have implemented that. Now we will go ahead and start working on the API endpoints. Now to create APIs and to implement API versioning on those APIs, we would need to install a package from Nuget Package Manager. We'll go to our dependencies, right click and manage Nuget packages. We will search for a package called as ASP.NET Core MVC.versioning. We would need to install this package if we want to implement versioning in our application. So we have the package here, which is the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.versioning. We will select this package and install the latest stable version. Once we have installed the latest stable version of the package, we will go ahead and then create a folder inside the controllers folder. So here the controllers folder outside your areas folder that was created by default by the ASP.NET Core MVC application. Inside this folder, we are going to create another folder. We will call this folder as API. Now this folder will contain all the API endpoints that we are going to create in our application. Inside the API folder, I'm going to create another folder and I'm going to call this as V1, which basically means version 1. So any APIs that we build for the first time or will be part of the version 1, we will add them in this folder called as version 1. It's a good way of implementing API in your application if we implement versioning, because in an event where we need to create a new API endpoint with new features, we don't have to delete the old API. Instead, we can let the users use the old version of the API, and once the new version is ready to be deployed and go live, then we can disable the old API endpoints or redirect users to the new API endpoints when they try to access the old API endpoints. So it's easy to manage the APIs. Rather than deleting them, we can redirect the users to our new API. So API versioning plays a very important role. So now we are going to implement API versioning. So first thing that we need to do is go ahead and create the profile controller inside this version 1 API folder, because we are going to create all the endpoints related to the profile view. So I'll go ahead and add a new file, and here I will go to ASP.NET Core, and here I will select the controller class, and here I will call this controller as profile. I'll hit new and the profile controller will now be created. Keep in mind that this profile controller inherits from the controller class. This controller class, if any controller class inherits from the base controller class, it means that this particular controller action method will have a view. In APIs, we don't have any views. We are just having endpoints that are used to return certain data from our database or from some files, but we don't have any view. So in that case, we need to use controller base instead of the controller class for creating the API. Now controller base basically means a base class of MVC controller without any view support. If you hover over the class, it will give you the definition of what this class means and what this class does. So now we can get rid of the index method and the return view from this particular class because this class is not going to return any view. Next thing that we want to do is we need to specify the version of the API. Therefore, at the class level, we will set an attribute. We will call this attribute as API version and we will set the version to 1.0. Now here you can see that the API version attribute is a part of the API version attribute .API version attribute, which is basically the package that we have installed. So next thing I need to specify is the API controller attribute, which defines this class as an API controller. Next thing after the API controller I want to define here is the route that will be used to access the API controller. So if I'm on the browser or I'm using a client to access this endpoint, so I will use the endpoint in a way like this, where I will specify the domain name like techaudi.com / the controller name or the API endpoint, then the version number and the controller name, which in this case will be the profile controller, and finally the name of the action method like GetUserProfile. So in this way I can access the endpoint, and that's the route I have specified to access the endpoint in the profile controller class. Here we will specify the version number and it will map over the version number accordingly. So now we need to specify the dependencies inside this class. Here we would need to add another attribute that will be the authentication scheme that we are going to use, so which users can access this endpoint. But since this is a profile controller and it's outside the admin area, this profile controller should be accessed by any authenticated user in our application, so it should not be just limited to the admin. So an admin user, if they want to get their profile details, they can call this endpoint. A user in your application who's not an admin wants to view their profile details can also call this endpoint. Therefore, we cannot set the authorize attribute for authentication scheme of the admin on this particular controller. We would need to create a new authentication scheme that can be used for any user in our application who has been successfully logged in to their account. So we will do that, but for now just we will leave it like this without any authorize attribute and go ahead and start working on the logic and required methods that we need. So here we would need a controller where we would instantiate the required dependencies, and here we will also need two objects that we will need access to get or fetch information from our database. So we would need the user service instance and we would need the cookie service instance in this API controller. Therefore, we would add them and add the missing references so that we can access this particular interface. Now for the cookie reference, we will use the cookie service project. We will import it, and now we are done with the constructor. For this profile controller, we just need these two properties, and now we will go ahead and use this instantiated properties in the endpoint methods that we need. So here in the profile controller API, we will require 4 endpoints. One endpoint will get us the user profile details. Then we have an HTTP post endpoint where we can update the user profile. We have another HTTP post endpoint which will be used to change the user's password. And we have an endpoint called as GetUserActivity, which will return the activities related to the user. We will start with working on the GetUserProfile. So here in the GetUserProfile method, the username is required to fetch the user information from our database. Therefore, we will concatenate this username to the endpoint route. And we have used the from route attribute here to map the value from the route to the parameter. If the username is null, then we will return a bad request. And if we have a username in the route, then we will use the user service to get the user profile by their username. We have not yet implemented this method. We will implement this method in a bit. If the result of the GetUserProfile_ByUsernameAsync is null, which basically means we have not found any user with that specific username, then we will return an HTTP response of not found. And if we find a result with a specific username, we find a user with a specific username, we will return the user back with an HTTP OK response. So this result object will contain all the user related information like their name, address, and so on. We will return it back to the client and it can be displayed onto the profile details form. So now let's go ahead and implement this GetUserProfile_ByUsernameAsync inside the user service project. So we'll go to the user service project and inside the user service class, we would need to create this method which will help us to get the user profile by their username. We have a method here that will get the user profile by their ID. We will implement the method to get the user profile by their username. So here I have implemented the method to get the user profile by username. Inside the method, I will be using the username that is provided in the parameters while calling this method and try to get the user information. In one of the previous video tutorials, we created the extension method to get the logged in user's ID. That's because we need to validate if the logged in user is requesting their user details and not somebody else. So here is the logic that is implemented to get the user details. Once we receive the user details from the database, we will map it over to this profile model and then we will return this user profile model. Here we have implemented the same logic as we have done in the GetUserProfile_by_ID. The only difference is that here we are using the user's ID to get the user profile, whereas here we will be using the user's username to get their profile. Here we would need to implement just one more logic, that would be that if the user is equal to null or the user.username is not equal to the username that is being sent in the parameters of this method. So if this does not match the username, which means somebody else is trying to get this user's information, therefore we will return a null response back to the requesting method. Similarly, we will add this same logic inside the get user by their profile ID, and here we will try to see if the user.user ID is not equal to the user ID that's being sent in the parameters of this method. So in this way, we can always make sure that the logged in user's ID matches the requesting user's ID. So next thing that we want to do is I have also implemented the extension method to get the user profile by email. This is to save time in case if somebody is requesting the user's profile by their email ID. then we can use this extension method. Now let's go to the interface and implement these two methods so that they can be accessible in our controller. So here from the user service, I'll copy this method and I will add it over here. I'll also copy the method to get the user profile by email and add it over here. I would not need to add the public keyword here, so I would just have to add the task, and that should be it. Now if I go back to the profile controller, I should see no errors because I would have access to the GetUserProfile.ByUsername method. In case if you want to create extension methods, you can create them over here, or extension endpoints, and you can create a method to get user profile by their username, email, or their ID. You can add it over here, but in this particular instance we don't need them, but you are free to do that. So this get user profile method is now complete. Now let's go to the update profile method. So we will expand this, and here while we are updating the profile of the user, if you remember in the profile.js, we are creating a form data object using the HTML form data API. That form data object is being sent in the uh, method, or in the Ajax method. So we need to make sure that when we receive the particular object, we make sure it's of type iForm collection, and therefore we will use the ASP.NET Core HTTP reference and use the iForm collection object over here. Now the next thing that we want to do, add the missing reference for our profile model using model service. We will get the username of the user from the form data, and then we will try to make sure that the password that was sent by the user matches the password that we have in our database. So when we try to submit the user's profile here, we try to do any changes, and when we try to submit this form, we get a pop-up which is requesting us to provide the user's password. So when the form is submitted, we need to make sure that the password is valid. And if it's not valid, we shouldn't update the user's details. Therefore, we are going to create another extension method called as ChangePassword.Async, which is an asynchronous method to check if the password that is provided in this request matches the password that we have for the user in our database. So let's go to user service and create this extension method over here. So here I have implemented the check_password_async method, and we are passing the profile model and the password itself in the parameters of this method, and we are validating the logged in user. And if the user is valid, then we will check the password using the user manager.checkPassword_async method. The user manager is a part of ASP.NET Core Identity, and ASP.NET Core Identity User Manager class has a method that is pre-built called as checkPassword. We can use this checkPassword or checkPassword_async method to validate the user's password. And if the password does not match, we will return a bool response which will be false, a boolean response. And if it is a valid password, we will return a true response back to the client. We also need to make sure we add this method to the interface so that it can be accessed in the profile controller. So now if we go back to the profile controller, we should have no errors here for the check password. Now if the password is valid, we will go ahead and update the user's profile. So we need to create the UpdateProfile_async method. This is an extension method, so we will create it in the user service project. So let's go ahead and create this update profile method over here. So I have created the UpdateProfile method, and the UpdateProfile method will require two additional extension methods that I have created. One is to update the profile pic of the user in case in an event if the user wants to also update their profile picture. We need to make sure we delete the old profile picture and then update the new profile picture. Also for the insert or updating the address. That's because our address table is a separate table in the database. Therefore, we will have to run an additional query on the address table as well in an event where the user wants to update their address. So let's go to the update profile async method. Here we are passing the form data object as the parameter in the method, and then we are getting the logged in user. We are doing the validation check to see if the logged in user is a valid user who is requesting the update for the user profile. Here inside the try catch block, we have created an activity model to add the user activity that the profile or there was any changes made to their profile. Now here we are first trying to see if the address exists, and if the address exists, we will update them. If the address does not exist, we will not update them. So in the registration form of our application, users, when they register, they don't have to provide their address. They only will be providing their country. So in most of the cases, you would not have the complete address of the user. So we would have to update the address in an event when the user will update their profile. So in the insert or update address method here, we have created two options, or we have a condition here. If the address already exists, we will update the address using the entity state modified property of the entity framework. Or if the address does not exist, then we will use the entity state added from the entity framework. Now we will commit the transaction and we will update the address table with the user ID associated with the address. If there are any issues while committing or while performing this database transaction, we will roll back the changes. We will also log the errors using the log file that we have created with Serilog. This extension method will be accessed only by this class, therefore it's private and not public. For the update profile method, here the extension method that is used to update the user's profile. What we are doing basically, if the user has a profile, first we will save that old profile pic to make sure in an event if the updating is failed, we can restore the old profile picture. And if the update is successful, we will update the old profile picture with the new profile picture and then delete the saved old profile picture. So it's always important to save the old file in an event where your server fails or you have an issue while updating using the endpoints and the transaction fails, the server transaction fails, you can restore back the old profile pic. So that's what I have implemented in the update profile async method. I have also added my comments in every step so that you can follow the code and you can understand it. Now this method also remains private because it will only be accessed by this user service class. Now once we update the user's profile, we will add the activity to the activity table and return a Boolean response true. Here, before we go back to the profile controller, let's copy and add this method to our interface. We will also need to add the reference to ASP.NET Core HTTP since we are using iForm collection. Going back to the profile controller, now we should not see any errors inside this method. Now, when we receive a result, which will be a Boolean result, and if the result is true, then we will return an OK response with a message that the profile is updated successfully. And if we return a false response, which means there was some issues or the validation failed, that can be multiple issues. So we will return a bad request response back to the client. Now we are done with the update profile method. Now let's look at the change password method that we have in this API endpoint. Here we are passing the password view model, reset password view model in the request body. Therefore, we have used the from body attribute. And first we are checking if the request is come in with an old password. If the model does not contain an old password, if the string is null or empty, we return a bad request because we always need the old password to change to a new password. We will check if the model state is valid, and if it's not, we return a bad request. Here we will try to get the user by their email, and we have already implemented this method. If the result of this call is null, which means we have not found any user, we will return a OK response, and we will not reveal that the user does not exist. Instead, we will return a OK response just to deceive the hacker if the hacker is trying to access somebody's account and change their password. Here we will then check if the old password that is provided matches the old password that we have in our database for that user. And if it does not match, then we will add an activity to the activity table stating that the password change attempt failed with the invalid old password. So if the user logs in, they can check that somebody was trying to access the account and change their password because they will see it under the activities. Here we have to create an extension method to add user activity for our user. We can use the activity service here, but I don't want to do that. I will instead create an add user activity extension method inside the user service class so that I can add the user activity. So let's go ahead and implement it. So here I've implemented the method add user activity, where we are passing the activity model from the profile controller, and we are just calling the add user activity method from our activity service and adding the activity model to our database table. We would need to once again add this method to our interface. So let's go ahead and add it. And now we can access this method from the profile controller class, and we should not have any errors. We will return a bad request that it's an invalid old password, because at this point we are not sure if it's the actual user or someone else trying to change the password of the account. Therefore, we'll return a bad request instead of an OK response. Now, the next step would be to check if both these validation steps pass. Then check if the result, which basically means that the result of the change password with the old with the new password was successful. Therefore, we will return an OK response. But before doing that, we would need to change the password. So we would need to create an extension method in the user service. So if the old password matched, we would now go ahead and change the user's password with the new password they have provided us. So let's go ahead and create this change password method here in the user service so we can use it in the profile controller. So here I have implemented the change password async method, where we are passing the profile model and the new password of the user. So first we will create a try catch block, and then we will try to create an activity model so that we can add this activity to the activity table. We will validate the user by calling the getLoggedInUserID method, and then if we have found the user, then we will go ahead and change the user's password. So in the user manager class of the ASP.NET Core identity, we have the password hasher dot hash password method, which can be used to change the user's password. In this method, we would need to pass the application user and the new password as the parameters. Now we have created an object to get the result of the update async method that we are going to do for the user. So the user's password gets updated, and this update result will have a property called as succeeded, which is a boolean type. So if the succeeded properties response is true or it's equals to true, that means the password was changed successfully. So we will add this activity to the activity table that the password was changed successfully and return a response back to the uh, method that it's true that the password was changed, so the response will be true. And if the user is equal to null, we return a false response. So I'm going back. Oh, we have to add the method to the interface so that we can access it in the profile controller. Now I go back. Now I should not see any errors, and now we will await for the response of the change password async method. As we know, the response is a boolean response, and if the response is true, then we will return a http OK response back to the client saying that the password was changed. And if the response is false, then we will return a bad request that the password could not be changed. We will add this message in the response. So we are done with the change password method of the API endpoint, and finally we will look at the GetUserActivity method. So we would need to display the user's activity in the activity view. We would need to get all the activities related to the user. Therefore, we'll go ahead and create an extension method called as GetUserActivity in the user service. Let's go ahead and add this method. So here I have implemented the GetUserActivity method in the user service. I am passing the username of the user, and here I am checking if the logged in user is valid. So here I will also add the flag to check if the user is equal to null or the users dot username is not equal to the username that we have in this particular uh, requirement or method call. So in either cases, we will return a null response. That's because somebody who does not own the account is requesting the account's activity. So if we found a user, the validation has passed, we will go ahead and query the database. We will get all the activities, querying the activity DB set using entity framework, and we will order it by descending so that we get the latest activities as per time. And we will only take 20 activities because if the user has 1000 activities, we don't want to display 1000 activities on the activity table view. And to fetch 1000 activities from your database, the query is going to take a while. So the HTTP request might take a minute or so, I don't know, depends on the speed of the internet. So it's always good just to show limited amount of activities. So you can change this number according to your requirement. So, and we will return this user activities list back to the method in the profile controller. But before we do that, let me go ahead and add this get user activity method to the interface. So I will add it over here. I would need to add system.collection missing reference for the list class. I go back to the profile controller, and now I should not see any errors. If the result is null, I will return an OK response with the data of the result. If the result is not null, I will return the activity, and if the result is null, I will return a bad request. So that should be it for GetUserActivity method. So we are done with the required methods that we need for profile controller API. We have implemented these methods and we have added them to the interface so they can be accessed. Now we would need to go ahead and test these methods in our application to make sure that the API endpoint is working as expected. We will also need to go ahead and make sure that the application builds. Also, we have added certain model classes in our DB set of our data service. So if we go to the application DB context, we would need to make sure that the country table is created and the migrations have been implemented. So we will do that in the next video tutorial, and we will start building this project and make sure that we get rid of any errors, and then we will go ahead and test the endpoints. So if you have any questions, use the comments section, and if you are looking for the source code, you can get the source code on the DevOps repo. The link will be in the video description. Please do not forget to like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy. Once again, thank you very much.